All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the next installment of the Conversations with the Dean. My name is Ashish Jha, and I'm a professor of health services policy and practice at the Brown University School of Public Health and the dean of the School of Public Health. And a couple of months ago, we started this series trying to bring in one expert, one kind of globally renowned expert every month to have a conversation about something that was particularly pertinent to public health. And we began 2 months ago with Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is the head of the National Institute for Immunology, Allergy, and Infectious Diseases at NIH. Last month, we had Professor Heidi Larson, who's really one of the global experts on vaccine hesitancy. And you can find both of those videos on the School of Public Health website. And in continuing this tradition of really having terrific global experts on a topic, I am very excited today to have Professor Wendy Schiller. So Professor Schiller is the chair of political science at Brown University. She is the Royce Family Professor of Teaching Excellence and Professor of Political Science, of course, as well as being the chair of the Political Science Department. She did her undergraduate at the University of Chicago, a PhD at the University of Rochester, has spent time at Brookings and Princeton before coming and joining us at Brown. And today's discussion is particularly timely and pertinent because what we're going to try to do today is cover a topic that those of us who are in public health and participating in this pandemic and trying to make our way through this pandemic and offer science and evidence-based guidance to policymakers, something that I think in general we have found really puzzling. And I will lay it out kind of, at least in the way that I have thought about it. And then I'm going to formally welcome Wendy and ask her to give some opening, just sort of reflections. But what's been striking in this pandemic has been how much our institutions that we rely on have not really worked. How so much of what we think is just science-based guidance has become deeply politicized and has become partisan. So public health being political is not a problem. Being partisan has been odd. And so we just find ourselves in a very unusual situation, or at least one that I find puzzling. And so when our group thought about who do we want, who's the person who can help us understand the moment, understand the world we're living in, we couldn't really think of anybody we'd rather hear from than Professor Schiller. So Wendy, thank you again for joining us and welcome to this conversation. And I'm hoping we can just start a bit there. As you look at this pandemic as a political scientist and as somebody who's studied the evolution of politics and policy in the United States, how do you reflect kind of more broadly on the intersection between the political time we're in, or literally 2 weeks from the election, and the response to the pandemic? I realize a little broad, we'll dig in, but I was just hoping you might give some overall high-level thoughts on this moment that we're in.
Well, it is unusual to have public health be so polarized. So it's not even just partisan, it's polarized. And the difference is the country 100 years ago was polarized. There were issues that were really divisive, not just slavery and Reconstruction and Jim Crow, obviously, and oppression in the South against African Americans as well as the North. It was also ideas about trade politics, about do you get involved in international conflicts. There were a lot of things that really viscerally divided the country. If you like, I'm a Congress scholar. If you go back in time and you read some of the debates in the 1930s, you can't imagine what they said to each other about these things. So it's not as if the country hasn't been deeply divided. But what's now happened is that the scope of the federal government is so much bigger than it ever was 100 years ago or ever was envisioned by the founding fathers, especially in the arena of our daily lives, of how we live our life, from the regulation of clean air, clean water, getting sort of regulation from the FDA on the drugs that we might take or the procedures that we might endure. This is all, post, not just post, World War II, but, there's just so much the federal government is involved with in our lives. And so what happened to public health and what happened to science, I think both of those things at the same time, is that as the Democrats had the majority in the Congress for so long and didn't win the presidency as frequently, but when you get to the 1990s, you get a sort of confluence of a shift in the South from a Democrat to a Republican majority. And of course, the moral majority in the 1980s, the conservative coalition comes along, and the Republicans see an opportunity in their efforts to limit government. They also start to attack government and science, government funding for science. They start to put restrictions when a Republican controlled Congress comes in the 90s on what Congress can fund. As you well know, Congress is still prohibited from directly funding research on gun violence, among other things. So politics starts to seep in this way that is really part of the endeavor to shrink the federal government and reduce its role in our lives. And that's really how we got here.
So I want to build on that a little bit before I come right to sort of the present day. Reasonable people can look at the US government or just our way of sort of our society and make different choices about the size of government, right? Like more individual choices versus government interventions. And again, we have a long history of kind of reasonable disagreements on those things. The tying of science to it is what I find puzzling. And I think you started down this path. So I wonder if you can build on this a little bit more, because what we find ourselves in at this moment, whether it's climate change, whether it's, well, certainly all this pandemic stuff that's going on, but there's a whole series of issues, is this deep sense that we are in a moment where a lot of people have deep skepticism of the scientific method, of science itself. Even President Trump yesterday said, you know, if Biden is elected, he's going to listen to the scientists, like kind of as though this was a problem. How did the goals and desires for a small, limited government get tied to what feels to many of us like an anti-science movement? Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. It has to do, I think, with federalism. And so we have, you look at Europe, and certainly they have versions of federalism, but they aren't nearly as enshrined as they are here in our Constitution and how they've developed. So when you think about the fights in the 1980s, well, going back to obviously, other kinds of events in the 1950s, but in the 1980s, creationism versus evolution really began to become a very big deal, a very big fight. And we had it in Kansas in particular. We've had a lot of those over history, but also in the 80s. So you had school boards outlawing or demanding that creationism be taught with evolution. And why is this important? It's the beginning of the idea that locality should determine a lot more of the context in how people live their lives. So when you get to education, it's not that far a leap to science and public health care. So what you find is that this connection starts to be, it's Tocqueville, we should be able to run our communities as we see fit, educate our children as we see fit, and if we want to teach creationism alongside evolution, then we should be able to do that. So it started to pit people who said, wait, there's science versus what is normally believed as religious belief or conviction. And that fight started to get meshed with federalism. Leave us alone. Let us do what we wish for our communities. And that, as the federal government started to get more involved in lots of things, that became, kind of ground zero for building the case. And climate change, as you mentioned, became a really ripe opportunity for fossil fuel industries to take advantage of this burgeoning sort of resistance to federal authority in your daily life and in your community life. And if you want to frack, or you want to drill for oil, or you want to dig for coal, you ought to be able to do that to have a livelihood, and nobody should be able to tell you otherwise. So then when you get into climate change and the science of climate change, it comes alongside that resistance.
All right, so I'm going to keep going on this because it comes to an issue that I've been thinking about, and I wrote a piece about recently. Here's a public health person writing essentially a quasi-political science piece about federalism and the pandemic response. And I wonder if I could just have you carry this thread all the way forward. And the basic notion behind this piece was federalism, or states' rights, has always, there's a long, complicated history of what we mean by states' rights and what it really invokes in people and what we're getting at. But in this pandemic, what we have seen is a federal government that has largely turned over the response of the pandemic to individual states, which many of us feel is deeply irresponsible because, of course, we think you need a national response. It's a global pandemic after all. But the second part is that there's been some benefits to federalism. So when the president demanded that Gretchen Whitmer open up Michigan, and she could say no, and because she was running a state, and again, we can talk about whether she had the authority within Michigan, but that's a different issue. And so there have been these huge benefits of federalism, because some states have been able to buck what has been sort of an irresponsible federal response. And so it's a very funny turning of the issue on its head of which states are bucking and which states are not. But is your sense of why this pandemic has been largely turned over to states really just a culmination of this 30-year march of federalism and letting local people make decisions? Or do you think, is that how you see the pandemic response in terms of national versus state responses?
I certainly think that sort of what's called civilian or voter or resident response in a lot of these states that have been not willing to wear masks and don't want to lock down, I think comes from that rhetoric of 30 years of don't let them tell you what to do, plus the undermining of the validity of science, right? So those two things in basically telling you how to live your daily life. Let's go back to that. This is the messaging. I have to wear a mask every day. Why can you tell me to wear a mask? But it's also about creating fear of the other. And you see a lot of parallels, I think, to the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s and early 1990s in where the virus broke out first. And when you think about it, it's not about liberal states. It's also just about geography, that these are states that contain people, more diverse states, people who might have higher levels of education, who might travel more, et cetera, certainly more diverse, more people of color. So when you think about that, the same rhetoric that has been used by Trump to demonize the other, and I think most observers pro and con to Trump will admit that that's what he does. It's the same thing. It says, oh, not only, should you not be told what to do, but why should we all suffer just to help those people in those states that have tended to be more liberal, have tended to push for things for people who have been discriminated against and outcast in society prior to this time. So it was a confluence. If this had started in, let's just use Kansas, if it had started in Kansas or Ohio or Michigan and devastated those places early, I think the federal response and Trump's response would have been quite different. And I think the residents of those states would have responded quite differently.
All right, I want to come back to this theme in a little bit, but I want to go back to a second theme, a set of questions that I've been thinking about as I was realizing I'd get a chance to talk to you about this, which is, so at the end of January, I wrote a piece. Turns out to be possibly the most wrong thing I've written. And I've written many things that have turned out to be wrong. This may be the most. It's really striking. I wrote a piece at the end of January about the pandemic that was coming. And I basically said, I think America is going to be fine. America is going to do well. And it's the rest of the world and American leadership in the world that I'm worried about, because American engagement in the world has really changed in the last 3 years. But I'm not so worried about the American response, because we have these fabulous agencies. We have the CDC and we have the FDA, and everything I know about them makes me think we have the gold standard public health response team. And why would we not be fine? And in retrospect, it seems particularly naive. But we did have the best agencies. Like the CDC is the best, was, maybe still is the best public health agency in the world. And I had no inkling that it would be sidelined and hobbled in a way that it has been. It's sort of some people have described it as, we went onto the racetrack and we had a Ferrari and we decided we're just not going to drive the Ferrari. And, we're going to put together I don't mean to pick on any specific car, but we're going to put together a handmade car that's not going to be very good. So how do you see the failure of the administration to use what I think is incredible competence and capability within the government? And have we seen this kind of stuff before, this kind of sidelining of expertise within the government? It's not even like you got to go out and get it and build it. You had it.
Yeah, so there's two different things going on here. So one is sort of the Republican fight with the CDC. And also going back to the 1980s, in 87 or 88, Senator Jesse Helms, very conservative guy from North Carolina, did attach an amendment to the funding for CDC, the appropriations bill. And it was a bill that said the CDC had to put, on AIDS literature that homosexual sex caused AIDS. And that they had to put this disclaimer on this literature designed to save lives. And only 2 people voted against that. It was, I think, 97-2, and one senator was absent. And it was very controversial, but it was a sign of the times that Democrats and Republicans both voted for this, and it was a way of hemming in the CDC in its educational mission to save lives. So there has always been, particularly a push from the Republicans, but joined by Democrats, a way of saying, oh, if you're doing something controversial with behavior that we find controversial, we will in fact try to rein you in or sideline you. So that's been there. The second is Trump himself. So this is also something, you're pro or con Trump. Trump likes Trump. He doesn't like to be outshined. He doesn't like to be not to be perceived as really intelligent and knowing lots of things. When you have experts saying, no, this is really serious, people will die. A, he didn't want to hear it. B, he doesn't want to be outshined. And certainly Anthony Fauci, as he did in the 80s, but with lots more media distribution, has become quite the star. That just bugged Trump personally. But second, Trump has political instincts that are very sound. And he knew that if COVID were real and he had to shut the government down, not the government, the country, this would cause him political harm and he could lose. And he thought, I'm going to take a bet, like he always does, that it will go away by June. It won't be as bad as people say. And that way I don't have to suffer any political consequences. So it's partly total irresponsibility on the part of the president, but with a political calculation. And again, going with the flow of this sort of Republican campaign and rhetoric, mostly Republican, against the CDC when it's giving advice that they think will be bad for their political futures.
Okay, I like it, but I'm not gonna push back, but I'm gonna just build on that a little bit. It's one thing to have Senator Jesse Helms, who was clearly anti-gay or homophobic and had a very clear worldview and was trying to push that on the CDC and didn't want a CDC that was willing to speak openly and truthfully. There isn't a worldview, or I wouldn't have thought there'd be a worldview in March, April, May about COVID per se, right? That it isn't the same kind of topic. And so I get the sort of, you don't want it to outshine you, but the hobbling of it and slowing it down struck me as like self-defeating in some ways. Just makes the federal response less effective. And how is that going to be politically helpful? So what am I missing there in the way in my puzzlement over this situation?
Well, there are, I wouldn't certainly ascribe this to every Republican senator or House member or politician, but there was a definite sense that these are not our constituents that will ultimately be harmed or die of COVID. And that's a brutal, horrible fact. But if you look at the rate of mortality, obviously you know that better than anybody, and you look at the groups that have suffered and died, if you are somebody who thinks about social welfare spending and you think about programs like Medicare, the program for the elderly, and Medicaid, certainly the program for low income, in addition to diabetes and heart disease and all the things that cost us money, and then you think about who people vote for, even though seniors, by the way, over 65 turn Republican. So this was a sort of doubly dumb political mistake to ignore this, and it appears to be costing the president votes now. But this is a brutal, callous reality that if you want to trim back federal services and you want to cut back, and the people who are dying are not your people, then you basically say, hey, this is just what happens. And I know, so it's not as if it was morally stigmatized, COVID. It just wasn't affecting the people that tend to vote Republican, in particular, a lot of areas. Plus, the Republicans have been doing this for so long, it was kind of a pretty hard pivot for most of them to say, oh, now we should listen to science. And now we should, and you see the governor of Mississippi, for example, the governor of Arkansas, they finally walked a line, but they finally said, listen, people are dying. We got to figure this out. We got to go with the science. So to your point, Trump himself could have pivoted. This is a big mystery, and I agree with you 100%. This is a guy who can pivot on a dime, and he could have said, listen, I know it's going to be hard, but we're going to shut down for 6 weeks. We're going to do our best. The science is going to help us. It's going to be not that bad. And he would have been a hero, and he would have weathered the economic storm of COVID, and he would have gotten reelected.
Yeah.
So maybe it was just a really bad, his one big political miscalculation. We'll see on November 3rd. But that could be just the one big political mistake, like Ford pardoning Nixon. Could be just the one thing you've done that, unfortunately, in this case, sadly, cost a lot of people their lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I mean, and by the way, that calculation of this was because in April and May, it was primarily blue states, not purple states or red states that were really being affected. And there's been a bunch of reporting out of the White House that there were several efforts to sort of think about a true national strategy. And ultimately, they all got squashed because a sense that this was primarily a blue state issue and not one that was going to ultimately harm the political fortunes of the president. Which of course, from a public health point of view, made no sense. Like the virus is not going to stay within the blue states. It tends to cross state boundaries quite efficiently. But nonetheless, so that, I mean, that's where I was going to essentially try to go out next and say it seemed to many of us that the politically savvy thing to do and the public health savvy thing to do were just really well aligned. But I think you've laid out why, at least in their mind or in Trump's mind, there was a calculation made that these two things could be separated and was better for him to take a different approach.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. See, he's not an ideologue. He plays one on TV, but he's not an ideologue. So he didn't have to do this. And this is the surprising thing. When you think about 30 years of individual responsibility, no federal government or limited federal government, and then you turn around and you try to pivot if you're a Republican governor, like Kemp in Georgia, and say, okay, now we're telling you to do something and you have to do it. It's almost impossible to reach those voters in the same way because you've conditioned them to not hearing the message. And the other thing is, if you believe in individual responsibility, they figure the people who knew better wore masks. There was no law against that. So in their mind, the people that are going to vote, the people who are well educated, the people who have good incomes, they'll probably be fine. They'll, and so we'll be okay. I mean, it's horrible. I don't think every Republican senator felt this way, but I certainly think at the top of the ticket, acknowledging it would have just, for Trump, was an unbearable sort of political calculation he was unwilling to do.
So let's just one more thing on this. So I have spent a lot of time over this past summer talking to Republican senators because one of the things that became very clear to us by the end of June, there was a group of us that realized we needed a lot more federal investments in testing and tracing. And the House was easy because the Dems were largely in, they had already passed it as part of their HEROES Act. And so we realized what we really needed was a group of Republican senators. And so we worked quite extensively, and that bill is still out there, but in individual conversations with these senators, and obviously this is all like, there's no camera, they're not totally reasonable about the need for testing, their approach, they, classic kind of more conservative stuff. We want money directly to states, we want let states do this stuff, but exactly the stuff you would expect. But it's what's really interesting is you get these guys alone, and they're exactly what I would expect. Kind of economically a bit conservative, more belief in states' abilities to do things, but none of the kind of anti-science stuff that comes out. So is that, I mean, and so there's this sense of like, these people are actually pretty reasonable, but they don't play that way on TV. What is that? Is that just sort of trying to play to a political base, or is that, why does that disconnect sort of seem to pop up over and over again?
Well, because what Trump has done, which is pretty remarkable, because George W. Bush couldn't do it, even though he had the Senate, the Republican Senate, for 4 or 5 years when he was president, is brand the party under his name. And the big fear for a lot of these senators, and you talk to them in the summer when most of the primaries would be over if they were running for re-election, they were so terrified of having a Trump-financed and challenger. And Trump had a mixed record on this over the last couple of years of supporting people, but they were concerned about that. And so they didn't have the freedom in the party to really bolt and say, okay, we feel differently. In fact, I think this is what you're hearing now from Republican senators on the side who are not running in 2020, that maybe now we can reconstruct the Republican brand if Trump loses, and also personally have a little more freedom.
Yep.
And that was the problem. And that's also something that afflicted the Democrats in 2014 when they lost the Senate. They were a team and they were led and they did things, but they were so identified as a team that they couldn't break out themselves. So this is their dilemma. And I think you're seeing this now. Certainly Ben Sasse, You're seeing it, and I'm watching these Republican governors in the South manage this. Alabama, you just had Governor Ivey say, listen, this is really serious. It's getting bad. We've got to take some action, because they are on the line for this, not only in terms of reelection, but also just the economic and personal well-being in their states. So I also think there's a slight disdain, not slight. I think there is a disdain amongst policymakers for people who are in impoverished conditions, or a disdain for people who have had trouble with weight or diabetes or other conditions. This sort of, individual responsibility works both ways. It's, yes, you're responsible. B, you're also responsible. And they blame the victim. And I think that was part of this until, as you rightly point out, the midsummer, when all of a sudden the red states really started becoming, hotbeds, and they are now. And I think, then they realize, oh, we really miscalculated.
Yeah. And there seemed to be a lot of openness to trying to do something that felt more national, which was interesting. One kind of last question on this line, which is to take the bit more of an international perspective. And there have been obviously lots and lots of countries that have handled this much better than we have. The famous ones that people often talk about are New Zealand, where the prime minister just won re-election. You have Angela Merkel in Germany, who has really done a remarkable job. I mean, there's an incredible video of her explaining R naught and what happens if the R naught in Germany is 1.1 versus 1.2, and hospitals getting filled up. And I think all of us just watched in amazement and thought, like, most PhD epidemiologists would struggle to do it with as much clarity as she did. I mean, she's a scientist, so she has a little bit of a leg up, but it's still pretty impressive to see the German chancellor be able to do that. And governments that have responded, that have been functional. And there is in a line that we often sort of talk about in public health, and I've been asking, I mean, do we basically have, this is going to sound really funny, but do we have the government we deserve? Like, have we gotten to a point where our government is just not capable of mounting effective, complicated responses to complex problems, to solve big problems? And that's what it feels like. It just feels like we are in a situation where our government just doesn't seem to be able to solve any of these problems. But by your look on your face that I am reading, you don't see it that way, or at least maybe you don't see it that way.
I certainly think that the scope of the responsibilities of the federal government goes well beyond what the structure of Congress can handle. Right? Congress wasn't built to handle a $4.4 trillion budget. It was not built to handle 4 million employees in the federal government. It wasn't built to handle this stuff. However, I think we have the capacity. I don't believe that the United States structure itself can't marshal itself to combat something and step up. I just don't believe that. I think certainly some of the people we have in office have not done what we would hope they could do. But also keep in mind, in the long haul, we've been struggling with democracy in very imperfect form for a couple of hundred years. So we are conditioned to the sort of experiment, American experiment, right? American exceptionalism. All over Europe, they've been, 60 years or so that they've been out of the realm of dictatorships, monarchies, authoritarian, being told what to do, right? Some of them even, like after the Cold War, it's only 30 or 40 years. That's just 2 generations. And so we are much more conditioned not to say, okay, everybody has to do the same thing. That's what America is, right? We can all be different. So I'm not sure that we should blame the entire structure of the government on this, as much as, if you're going to condition a country to believe this about itself, it's going to be hard, but not impossible, to rally when you've got an external threat. And certainly the federal the federal leadership let us down this time. But I don't know that that's a capacity argument.
Yeah, and it is a question that comes up a lot, because it is, and it's an honest, I don't know what I'm about to say, but when I think about the effectiveness of these public health agencies, and I started by saying my bias going in was we had these highly effective public health agencies and we were going to do fine. And obviously there was the political meddling, but at least some people have started asking the question, actually, are these agencies nearly as capable as we thought they were? Or have we degraded them enough over time by not investing in them, by by essentially talking down these bureaucracies, so the best people are not there as much. I don't think that's totally true, but I do think there's still some superb people at a lot of these top agencies. But at least it feels like there is more of a problem than just the political appointee and the meddling from the White House.
I think that's right, and part of it also has to do with state regulation, particularly of health. Right? So insurance regulations at the state level, and so much of the regulation of nursing homes, for example, is state and local level. And so some of the practices that we saw that were damaging are regulated by the states or localities, and government itself across the board is not as efficient as it could be. And certainly the resistance to thinking about care outside of a convalescent setting for a lot of people. Let's pay for it in their homes. Let's expand Medicaid. Let's change Medicare and what it pays for. These are all things that need to be innovations. And this is the thing that I think is so interesting that you also pointed out earlier about the state divide. The civil rights was the federal government's going to come in and make sure that you don't discriminate. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, obviously simplifying grossly. But over 30 or 40 years now, the states that are really progressive don't want the federal government, which tends to be now more status quo and conservative, to come in and tell them they have to go backward. So the very notion of being liberal or progressive and thinking the federal government should do everything just is on its head right now, because a lot of the states that have made the most gains and are more progressive and have, like Rhode Island has done pretty well, they are doing it on their own without the federal government. So this is going to change the political frame for everything going forward.
Yeah. And it is interesting because on one hand, as I was writing that piece, sort of talking about federalism, I found myself essentially arguing, and again, I'm not a political scientist, and it felt really funny for me to say this, but there was an element of like, thank God for federalism. Mm-hmm. Like, thank God that Charlie Baker and Gina Raimondo and Gretchen Whitmer can do a bunch of things and not have to listen to Trump saying, open everything up. And that's the upside of this. But it does feel like, ultimately, in a global pandemic, it's really hard to not have an effective federal government, because states can do a lot, but they can't do some fundamental things that you need only the federal government to be able to do. And
when you think about public health crises or safety, when you think about seat belts, right? Ralph Nader, starts in 1959 saying, hey, we should do this. 1960, how do you get, so the federal government has to require car manufacturers just to put the seatbelts in. That takes 15 years. And then just to get seatbelt laws, which didn't come to full fruition till the end of the 1980s or early 90s. And you think that's a basic fundamental public health issue, right? And so you think how hard it is to get people to commit to individual changes in their life when they hear it from the federal government. Same with drunk driving, which has just been reduced quite a bit, but through federal mandate, and more punishment. So when you think about mask wearing and public health going forward, you think it's got to seep into the public consciousness at the individual level. We have to do this because it's the safe thing to do. And we know from our history, it usually takes a decade rather than, 6 months.
All right, I have to, I'm going to, at this point, switch to questions from the audience because there's so many good ones. And I know there were some pre-specified ones, which I will get to, but I actually want to get to one of the questions that was thrown in the chat, which has come up a bunch, this topic. And I wondered if you had a thought on this, which is that people often point out that the countries with the best response are all led by women. Mm. And so the question that was asked is, do you think the COVID-19 response would have gone better if we had if we had a woman as president of the United States? But I mean, again, we're getting into small sample size issues, but I don't think there's nothing to that. And that's my view, but I'd love your views on this. Do you think there is something about women leaders, without making too many gross generalizations, that is associated with a more effective response, or are we just stretching there?
Yeah, so there's an article that just came out, and if anyone wants to email me, I'll send you the link to it. There's an article where this was studied, basically, in the Journal, I think, of Applied Psychology, perhaps, just came out, that said women leaders in the first couple of months, March and April, did better and had fewer deaths in their states with women governors, only 9 states with women governors, did much better than with men, and even controlling for state size and comparability. And the reason was the way they spoke about it, that they used messaging, community messaging. that said, we're in it together, please do this. They used to call Gina Raimondo the Italian grandmother, just let's get this done, let's do it. And that they used both a combination of community language and comfort language and caring language of all three things, and that those messages were more effective. So that was the argument. And so that's what we know so far. And obviously we want to test that out across the span of the pandemic, but there's some evidence that that's true.
All right, I like it. Switching gears on, and this is a question from the pre-submitted. So one of the things that keeps coming up over and over again in this sort of individual collective responsibility, when all of us sort of look and say, why are we struggling to have a more effective pandemic response? A classic line that I hear over and over again is American individualism, that Americans don't like being told what to do. So I think you've already talked about the conditioning that went into that this is not a random thing, and that narratives really are important. But how do you, so if you were advising, let's say there is a President Biden, and if you're advising a President Biden on this issue of trying to get people to think a bit more about collective responsibility, and because I get asked all the time about, is it an abridgment of my freedom to have to wear masks? And I try to reframe the freedom issue in a slightly different way. How do you think about what can a leader do to counter that 30 years of conditioning around individual rights? I should be able to do whatever I want, and I shouldn't be forced to be responsible for other people.
I think part of it is the messaging in the beginning, or even still now, is you wear a mask so you don't infect other people. And of course, we know that you can't stay super safe with a mask or anything if you're around other people, but there is some element of protection to yourself when you wear a mask. So I think that would help. But the second thing would be, Biden can say, listen, we're in a really difficult time, but I want your business to open again. I want people to go to the movies again. I want you to be able to go out for dinner again. And if we don't all wear masks, we can't get that part of our life back. And just continue to connect it to the loss of the daily activities that we enjoy, and that maybe, and also be willing and open on ways of reconfiguring those activities so that we can continue to do, so we can go back to doing them. I think that's what Democrats are good at, actually, over time. In crises, Democrats are good at saying, we have to make some sacrifice, but there's light at the end of the tunnel, and this is what we think the world will look like when we're through. And I think Biden, if he's elected, he knows how to do that. And I think he'll be effective at that.
Yeah, great. So another question that's come through that's a bit related, but a bit different, is around vaccines. So really complicated moment that I think we're in on vaccines. The next 2 weeks, I think, have some very potentially risky things coming on the vaccine front. But let's say we get to a point where there isn't a vaccine available. Could you imagine, well, let me ask most bluntly, could you imagine that the federal government could mandate people get a vaccine, or could states mandate that people get vaccines? Or is that just out of the realm of what would be possible?
Well, I certainly think public schools, and I just was going through some paperwork and found my original vaccinations from when I was a baby and a young kid. Remember, public schools just say you can't come to school unless you're vaccinated. Yep. Certainly private institutions, state schools, they can all say, listen, you can't do that. So, and private businesses could certainly mandate that you can't come. Now, whether you can't mandate that you ride the subway, you have to have a vaccine. I think that's probably not okay. Yep. And so in that sense, the DNA, when people's DNA is taken, for what reasons, I think there's some parallel things there in terms of getting a shot. So I think that there are a lot of institutions that we are integrated into in our daily lives that can legally require that you have what is you're calling a vaccine. And I've been getting some questions that I'd like to ask you now. Is this something you envision to be an annual COVID shot, like a flu shot? Or is this like the mumps, rubella, measles vaccine I got when I was a kid? I think that's another problem with the communication that's been happening.
Yeah. So let me give you the short answer on that. I think in the first couple of years, it's probably going to be an annual shot. And just a little bit of it's not because the flu shot is annual, because the virus changes every year and there's antigenic drift, and so we come up with a different vaccine every year. That's not going to be the issue with COVID. I think it's going to be a stable virus, but my guess is that the immune response just won't last beyond 12 months. But I can easily imagine in 2-3 years, we'll get really high quality vaccines, just in terms of duration of efficacy. And you could end up getting a vaccine that gives you 5 years of protection or something, and then you could take it less often. But absolutely, in the beginning, my expectation is that we're going to be getting our annual, you get your annual flu shot, and you'll get your annual COVID shot.
Mm-hmm. And I think obviously the anti-vaxxers movement is also a product of the times and a product of this sort of cultivated distrust of science, but also genuine fear.
Yeah.
People have fear, and we're all human, and we'd like to all say we behave perfectly all the time and can accept science. But if somebody says, "Oh, I got a vaccine and this is what happened to me," it makes you a little nervous. And I think Republicans haven't really found a way to deal with that except sort of cultivate that. And I think they recognize now, for political survival over the next decade, they're going to have to figure out a way to handle this, because even if Trump holds on, others won't. And they're going to have to grapple with it in a way that Democrats are typically more fluid about.
Yeah, great. Okay, let me get to a few more questions that, sorry, here we go. Okay, so a couple of questions, moving a little bit more into the global space. So one of them, again, there have been many puzzling things in this pandemic. One of them was the very aggressive attempt to cast blame of the response on the WHO. And then, so when that began, and I did a lot of writing and talking about this, I basically saw it as like a distraction. Like, oh, they're just blaming WHO, but the Trump administration is not really going to be serious. And then he threatened to withdraw from WHO. And I mostly rolled my eyes and said, they're not going to actually go through with it. And then they actually went through with it. Mm-hmm. And that has been, again, just the number of things I have gotten wrong. I really just didn't think they would go all the way through with it. It certainly is consistent with this kind of America first, our approach. How have you seen our engagement with the global community? I guess more broadly, but particularly, obviously, I'm interested in during this pandemic. And how do the politics of that work for someone like Trump?
Well, I think that Trump set the stage in his 2015, 2016 campaign with, immigrants are the other. They're the other, even though most of us, if not all of us, are immigrants, so descended from immigrants. But that's what he set the stage for. But this has been another talking point going back to Jesse Helms and the United Nations. He didn't want to pay the dues. And Bob Dole didn't want to authorize troops to go into the Balkans because we'd be under NATO command or some French command instead of being separate. This has been a thread in the Republican Party that's a pretty firm thread for a very long time. It was a very easy thing for Trump to do, to solidify a corner of his base that might not like everything else he does. But this is the way he's constructed his coalition, but his coalition hasn't expanded. But he's kept the 42% that he had on Inauguration Day just by doing this. So this is this is an interesting thing, because in the new Republican Party, the next gen of the Republican Party, Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, Mike Lee, and Ben Sasse, among others, they're having battles. Do you engage or don't engage with the world? And I think it goes right into our economy. Most people understand. You talk to somebody and say, well, I'm ordering something, but I can't get the part, because we are interconnected globally. But it's this international, it's resistance to international control. And these are, again, the kind of talking points and the kind of theories and philosophies Republicans have had. But you see this over the next 10 years. And from a business standpoint alone, it's not sustainable.
Yeah.
So that's why I think if Trump were to lose, I think you'd see an opening up, not just with Biden presidency, but you'd see an opening up in the Republican Party on issues of science and public health and globalization, because I think they recognize their current position is unsustainable.
Yeah, it has struck me. I mean, it's interesting to think about fears of global control of American policy and the need for national autonomy. What's funny is when you go attend meetings in the senior leadership of WHO, the small and medium-sized countries actually complain that America has too much influence over WHO. It is the biggest donor to WHO. And if America says something, it's very hard for WHO to ignore it. And in fact, I've always thought whether we have too much control or not is a different conversation, but that sort of soft power that America wields by being deeply engaged in these international institutions, by being just generally the biggest supporter of global health, has these enormous benefits for our country. Beyond being a good thing to do, right? If funding HIV treatment in Africa is a really good thing to do, but it also has all of these big spillovers. And my sense is that's not necessarily how some large chunk of the Republican Party sees it. They don't see those things as ultimately being much more beneficial than costly to America.
Well, the George Herbert Walker Bush and the George W. Bush administrations did. They
Yeah,
were very much globally engaged, and of course, PEPFAR is George W. Bush, and he's quite proud of that. And
and he
so
should
it was,
be.
yeah. I think that wing of the party, but there's a sort of less well-off wing of the Republican Party that has come up over the last 20 years that didn't feel served by that. And again, I think also the Democratic passage with the Republicans of free trade agreements that literally decimated towns across America, and industries are gone. We don't make clothes here anymore. We don't make shoes here anymore. There's so many things we don't make here anymore, and these are all livelihoods. They're all gone. So I think there hasn't been enough attention paid to that, and that ties into why should I listen to you on COVID when you didn't? My town is dried up, and you didn't help me then. So
Yeah.
I think these messages have to go hand in hand, and unfortunately, on both sides of the aisle, they haven't.
I'm going to bounce around a little bit, just trying to pick what I think are some of the most interesting questions coming in. So one, it's a pre-submitted question, which is how can we combat misinformation coming from people who appear to be experts, people like Scott Atlas? And let me just kind of embellish this a little bit. In this pandemic, expertise is an interesting notion because there's like expertise and then there's like real expertise, right? So for instance, I feel pretty expert on broad public health issues, but when there is a new study on genomic kind of variations that are happening within the virus and whether this represents a new strain, I pretty quickly get out of my depth. But I know who the world's leading virologists are, whose views I will trust, right? So when that question comes up, I will say, well, I wonder what Angie Rasmussen at Columbia thinks, and what she thinks drives because she's really good. But it's my ability, so it's not even like I've spent my whole life in public health, but there are plenty of areas in which I don't have true expertise. And then you have someone like Scott Atlas, who has literally spent none of his life doing any of this stuff. But he's a doctor, he's a professor at Stanford. So he seems incredibly well credentialed and can easily turn this into a fight between a doctor at Brown versus a doctor at Stanford. It all seems like it's academic, where anybody who knows this understands this is not academic at all. What advice, I don't even advice, or how do you think about misinformation from people who are well credentialed, seem like they could be experts, where in the field, none of the experts think that that person has any expertise?
Well, I think this is what our communications world has produced, right? So when you had only three networks, they very rarely had experts on. They didn't have the time for it in a 22-minute broadcast. As soon as you get cable and you have to fill the airtime, this is true in politics, it's true in public health, it's true everywhere, then you have the invention of a lot more experts. And then, of course, you have the social media platforms to distribute all of the material. So I think that's just a general technology change. And I do think that debunking experts who are not experts and or are passing on false information is a one at a time job. You can do that if you hear a conversation that's inaccurate. You can do that in your own family. You can do that in your workplace. Stop, take the time and say, hey, I'm not sure that's right. Do you know about this other thing? Don't yell at anybody. Don't insult them. Just try to do it. And I think one by one, if you just make the effort and continue to make the effort, part of that starts to crumble, that facade of false information. But it's going to take a lot of work. We're trained to believe what we read. And that's true of Facebook on our phone or the Washington Post or New York Times or Wall Street Journal. And that we're trained that way. And so that's one of the biggest hurdles we have to overcome.
Yeah. And just building on that, so over the weekend, there was a really interesting thing that happened. It was on Saturday. Scott Atlas, speaking about Scott Atlas, tweeted something where he basically linked to an article and basically said masks are useless, and linked to an article that was mostly gibberish. And his tweet his tweet referenced Oxford, like had all these code words of great institutions where this research has been done. And so it's interesting because I was actually at a soccer game for my youngest one. And during halftime, I started reading this and I just wrote a short tweet basically saying, this is disinformation coming from the White House and it is not helpful and blah, blah, blah. And I called it junk science. and said, as just like junk food, it tastes good but has no nutritious value, right? And what ensued was basically, and I'm not saying I was solely responsible, but probably two or three of us making this a big deal. It really blew up, and by Sunday morning, Twitter had taken his tweet down. And for a little while, he was locked out of his Twitter account altogether. I didn't call for his tweet to be taken down or for him to be locked out, but certainly lots of other people then did. Social media platforms are struggling here as well, right? Because they literally took down the tweet, or they've taken down the tweets of the president. They've taken his top scientific advisor, or one of his top, like, but it's interesting that is that going to be are they going to be the gatekeepers of information? And do we want them to be the gatekeepers of information?
Well, the
How
answer
do
to
you
the
see
second question
this?
is no, you don't want that to be the case. You used to have print, which was subject to libel laws and slander. And so you had editors looking at things and fact checking, and tried to make sure as best you could, but there really isn't a similar infrastructure. And we're so reliant on it. Everybody's reliant on it. And politicians are especially reliant on it. So the fact that they're beholden and reliant, and businesses are reliant to Google, for example, means that their inclination to rein these businesses in, although the Justice Department did file an antitrust suit against Google today, but and all that we're relying is their good moral graces. I mean, they have to live in the same world we do, even though they live at a higher level with more money. It's still the same world. So I think Twitter seems to be more sensitive to this than Facebook, as far as I can tell. And you're thinking, and cable, even the more conservative channels, Fox News, it's gotten a little better about saying, yeah, no, maybe. And so I do think there's some moral responsibility that they're starting to take, but no, it feels, I didn't live in the 1890s. It feels like the 1890s when there was no regulation and media was exploding and they could say whatever they wanted.
And how do we deal with this? Like, because clearly it's a huge problem in the middle of a pandemic where people exploit, and I don't mean that word, well, I do mean that word in that way, exploit this ability to like then get all this misinformation and disinformation out.
Well, the first question I say when someone says, well, they say, I always say, who's they?
Yeah.
Who's they? So if somebody cites something, particularly getting into the holidays, just say, who's they?
Right.
And just ask somebody to probe a little more deeply, and don't take it on face value, and really try to do a little research. But it's harder and harder to find where you can go. And I think, to me, just to end this line of conversation on the administration's actions, they've also sort of disrupted web pages that you used to go to at the government level to get data. You can still go to the census, thank God, but you can't go to very many of these places and get histories and get real information about climate change or about health. They've just completely distorted the gateways of information for taxpayers to hold government accountable. And that is something that we have got to push to change somehow.
Last question, I think, depending on how much time we have, maybe we'll try to squeeze in one more. But so in studying the 1918 flu pandemic, one of the things that comes out, and this comes out in lots of public health things, and actually you could argue, forget the 1918, the HIV pandemic, right? It has these profound effects on our society that are long lasting, that are hard to see when you're in the middle of it. But they really do change societies in very, very important ways. And I feel like HIV certainly did that. The influenza pandemic did that. And I literally told you it's hard to see it when you're in the middle of it, but I'm going to ask you anyway. How do you think this pandemic changes politics in America over the next 5-10 years? Or do you have any gestalt on where you think it goes? And obviously some of it will clearly depend on what happens 2 weeks from today. But more broadly, can you envision us having a conversation 10 years from now and you saying COVID really did X, Y, and Z? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are three things. One is from the political level. I think that it puts more pressure on both Republicans and Democrats and libertarians and socialists and anybody else who's running for office to show some concern and commitment to public health. What would you do? What would you fund? What would you vote for? Are you in the Congress or the state legislature? What will you do to help keep us safer? And how would you react differently? And I think these are questions that will be posed for years and years. I think the disruption's been so profound. So that's one thing, and I think that's a good thing. Second, I think that in terms of voting, I will say this: I would not wish the COVID pandemic on anybody, but we now have more opportunities to vote in different ways for longer periods of time than at any time in our recent 100-year history. So you can vote for 3 weeks early in person, you never could before. We're not going back. That has changed voting access forever, and my prediction is it's expanded it, and it will continue to expand, which is good for the democracy. And the third is personal and human. I think it has given us a wake-up call that we haven't had in quite some time that says we are all in this together, that we are interconnected by virtue of being human, and that we have to know that and recognize that, and we can't make it on our own. And sooner or later, that lesson's going to come home to everybody. And I think that lesson persists for sure over the next 5 to 10 years.
Great. Good. That is a really strong, I think, and helpful note to end on. I want to say, first of all, thank you for taking time to have this conversation. I want to make sure that I give you the last word in terms of anything else that you think we should know or think about in terms of this intersection between the greatest public health crisis and what had already been, before COVID showed up, a pretty profound political crisis. I mean, this issue around feeling like, are the fundamentals of our democracy still intact? Are the norms of democracy still intact? These were questions that we were discussing a year ago, right? These were not, and it feels like the greatest public health crisis came right on top of this political crisis. You know, I guess the question that I leave with, and wondering if you just might want to give a few thoughts to as we wrap up, is, do you think as we emerge from this, that this makes our democratic institutions stronger in the long run? Or do you think this questioning that we've had about what the state of our democracy is, do you think this pandemic, like, how do you see the pandemic affecting kind of our democratic institutions, I guess? And
Well,
are you optimistic about that for the future?
I do think that sort of the red-blue divide will get shaken up by this, and people will say, you know, somebody lives in Louisiana and lost a grandmother or lost a spouse or lost a child. You think, oh, you feel for those people. You feel connected to those people, even though you're nowhere close to their politics or geographically contiguous. So in some ways, like I said, I do think what comes out of this is that we're all really in this together, and people have suffered greatly in a lot of ways. So I think that's a moment in time with the right rhetoric and the right private and public leadership that can be used to reform our institutions, because they need some reform. And we have to remember that we're in the 21st century, and it's a world that the founders would probably not recognize in a lot of ways, but in some ways, someone like Ben Franklin would recognize it. But new technology means that we have to adapt in all sorts of ways. And we have to be willing to let go of some of the old framework to welcome in a better new framework. And I think that will be the journey that we go on as a result of COVID. I think it might have come anyway, but it has accelerated it. And I think that's where we're going to be in the next 5 to 10 years, is trying to hash out what we need from government and what we don't, and what kind of government we want. And I think we'll still debate it, but I think we're going to move forward in that over the next decade.
And if that is one of the silver linings of COVID, then maybe that's not so bad. And if it brings our nation together in a bit of more of a sense of shared journey, that's also not the very worst thing in the world. So those are great. Those are really good points to end on. Wendy, thank you so much for taking so much of your time to have this discussion. I feel like I have learned a ton, and I'm sure the 300 or so people who joined us did as well. Stay safe, stay well. And again, thank you so much for being part of this.
It was my pleasure. Thanks.
All right. Be well.